Welcome to the Affirming Village Podcast, where we center neurodivergent voices, affirm diverse ways of being, and empower families, educators, and advocates with knowledge that truly honors the whole learner. We're your co-hosts, Dr. Destiny Huff, a late diagnosed autistic ADHD mental health therapist and non-attorney special education advocate, and Lisa Baskin Wright, an ADHD and dyslexic educator and IEP coach. Together, we dig into conversations about neuroaffirming practices, special education, and disability rights. Please remember, nothing shared on this podcast is medical or legal advice, and the views shared here by the host and the guest are their personal opinions. This space is for educational purposes only, to help you feel informed, empowered, and never alone in the village.
Welcome back to the Affirming Village Podcast. Today, we're digging into one of the most powerful tools that can either open doors or create barriers for students: documentation and accessibility in the IEP.
Yes, documentation isn't just about keeping records. It's about making sure a student's supports are clear, accessible, and actually usable in their day-to-day learning. When documentation is vague or inaccessible, it creates confusion for parents, teachers, and the learner.
And accessibility isn't just physical. It's the words we choose, the way goals are written, the clarity of accommodations, and even how parents and schools communicate with one another.
Excuse me. Exactly. Clear, specific language is what holds everyone accountable. It's how parents know their child's needs are being met and how schools can show they're providing what's promised.
So, in this episode, we're going to break down why documentation protects both parents and schools by allowing everyone at the table to understand what the learner's supports actually are and who will be implementing them.
So grab your notes, because we're about to give you some practical strategies you can use at your next IEP meeting. So if you're new to our podcast, again, in the beginning of every episode, you will hear us use a script. And that is just essentially to welcome you into the episode and let you know what it's going to be about. So this episode was, brought to the forefront by Lisa. So I'm going to let Lisa start off with kind of like what inspired this and, which way she wants to go with it.
Sure. So, yes, I had an opportunity to meet with a family. Definitely, I both offer like these sort of 1 hour ask me anything kind of consultations. So it's not necessarily with folks that we're super familiar with or know a lot about their learner. It's sort of this kind of one-time snapshot. And I had a lovely family come to meet with me who, up until this point, has had a relatively smooth, from her perspective, IEP process. And her learner was making a transition from the elementary school to the middle school, and things were kind of going a little bit sideways, and the supports that she thought were in place weren't in place. And so we were going through kind of her documentation in the moment, where she was kind of reading me things and we were talking about, and there were all these kind of issues that popped up. Some of those issues were around sort of the good intent that had the not great impact of really kind, loving teacher at the elementary level saying, we're just going to do these things because this is what the learner needs, but not necessarily properly documenting them. So when that learner was transitioning to the next grade level, those supports, accommodations were not codified within the IEP, and so they did not follow the learner, and so therefore they were not in place. And the other thing that really bubbled to the surface for me was, because they had this positive working relationship, the parent was able to rely on that to know that her learner was safe and sort of being well held within the school space. But it a little bit masked her lack of understanding of what all the ins and outs of the IEP process were. So when, entering sort of this new school and this new team and this new system, essentially, she didn't even know what to advocate for. She wasn't sure what certain language meant in the documentation. She wasn't sure what language to use to have the things in place that had been done. And I kept thinking to myself as I was, chatting with her, not only did the team kind of misstep in terms of really making sure that that transition process went more smoothly for this young person and that those services were documented properly.
Mm-hmm.
But they also, and I know this sounds super judgy, and I don't mean it that way. Teachers are holding a whole lot, but there wasn't space in the process to make sure that the parents understood what all the different supports were that had been in place, that needed to be in place, what those things were called, how the data had been collected, what the decisions, had been based on, and what to advocate for moving forward. And so they hit this sort of gap in support, and the learner was paying price.
Yeah, and I think like first of all, you just hit on so many things that are very common. One is it's that um one that there's not always ill intent, right? So like you mentioned, you have this educator who is just like, hey, I know this learner, this is what works for them, so I'm just going to do it. And that a lot of times is just part of being a really good teacher and
Totally.
learning your kids and building that relationship and establishing that rapport, and then the parent putting trust in you, right? But what you talk about is something I mention a lot when my learners get ready to transition from pre-K to kinder, from elementary to middle to high school, and then just any grade. It's important that what the staff is doing is in the IEP. It's
Yes.
in black and white for everyone to see. And sometimes we can get, again, just wrapped up in what we're doing, how it's going. The parents, like, they're doing so good, they're doing so great, right? And no one thinks, to go that extra step and go, but we need to make sure that what's working and what's helping them do so good and so great is actually documented in the IEP.
Yes, absolutely. And I've had this happen, same district actually, but different family, where there was this great intent and lovely folks who knew the learner, and the way this district, for whatever reason, I don't know why, documents one-on-one support, para support as an accommodation,
Mm-hmm.
which doesn't make sense to me because it really is a service. And so it needs to trip the wire to the district office that, like, we need to hire a FTE, like a full-time employee,
Mm-hmm.
or, maybe not a full-time employee, but we need to hire a person to
Mm-hmm.
fulfill this role. That this district was able to just, oh, it's an accommodation, it's not a service. And so a different parent got notification literally at like 7:30 the night before school started, saying your learner no longer has this accommodation. And it was like, no. Right. So it can be used kind of both ways, where it's
Mm-hmm.
like the good intent of the folks that are doing the thing, they know the thing needs to be done. But
Mm-hmm.
the backside, the ugly backside of when that isn't clearly documented, then the powers that be that determine how many employees we need and staffing determinations and like, they don't
Mm-hmm.
have all the information they need in front of them. So even if it's not ill will, it's just working off of faulty data,
Right.
the learner pays the price.
Absolutely. And, you know, again, what you're speaking to too in that regard is how things are documented, right? So, like, as I've stated, my son has a one on one. And I want to be abundantly clear, he's proud of his one on one. And he says that everyone should have a one on one. Like, that's not information I would just put out there. He wasn't, comfortable with that. And he's like, everyone should have one. It's very helpful. But in his IEP, the way in which it's documented, it is documented as a service. And
Sure.
so, how they have it in his IEP is that the service minutes that he gets with his special education teacher are documented in a section. The service minutes that he gets with his speech language pathologist are documented for pragmatics. And then they actually have the paraprofessional support documented in its own little box grid to demonstrate, and it has the subjects for which that support is provided. And so, yeah, what you're absolutely speaking to is that something that I think, listening to this podcast, people have probably seen in IEPs, whether you're staff or parent, is that sometimes in accommodations, they'll say things like, needs supervision during recess or lunch or specials, and specials referring to music, PE, art, those things. Or they'll say needs adult during lunchtime, or there's so many different phrasings, and that does not sufficiently document the need for a one-on-one, because essentially what you could say is, okay, cool, I'm going to send, let's say you're the special education classroom. Special education classrooms tend to have a higher teacher to student ratio. So that's saying, I'm just going to send one of the paras, if they're available, with Destiny to lunch.
Right.
Versus documenting that, no, we are saying that Destiny is supposed to have a one-on-one for safety or support during that time, and that if the assigned one-on-one is not present, you still legally, per FAPE, and we are not attorneys, must provide a staff member during that time. It's not an optional thing.
Absolutely, yes. The IEP is not just a recommendation. It's actually a legally binding contract.
That part.
That part. Say the two non-attorneys, but
right. And it's that's that documentation part is so important. It's not just about documenting what's occurring. It's important to document it correctly. I've seen many times where in an IEP meeting, parents will bring accommodations. One of my running things that I say is that nobody does more research than a parent of a disabled learner. And
Absolutely.
So parents will bring in accommodations, and the team will go, yeah, no, we can totally put that in. Then when the parent gets the document, the accommodation is not stated the way in which was discussed or explained that way or tweaked. I know I've seen that many times, and it often then actually alters what the actual accommodation is. Have you seen that, Lisa?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, I've seen all kinds of shenanigans. And I know you have too. I mean, I've seen things like, this is the list of accommodations that we can use and nothing else is, allowable. No.
That's
And
not
then
how
I have this reel that I put out, I don't know, like a week or so ago. It actually sat in my drafts folders for quite some time because it used language. And so I was a little hesitant to put it out, but I finally did. And it's the like video of the 20th Century Fox and the song that goes with it, but instead of the 20th Century Fox popping up, it says, I don't give a fuck. I was like, I don't know, right? Like, I do give a fuck about pretty much everything, right? So it's like, I couldn't think of what to put, right? So I ended up putting like a teacher saying, I've been a teacher for 25 years and I've never seen a student with so many accommodations in their IEP, right? Because I have heard that. And when I do hear that, my response is the messaging in the reel. And it has made its way to the part of the internet where people think I'm bashing teachers. And I'm like, oh, for the love of all things holy. So I just haven't even responded because I don't have bandwidth. But there's been some commentary that's really crazy. But I think that there is a little bit of that mentality, and certainly it's showing itself. Like if we take this very microcosm example, like it is showing up in the comments section of that reel of like, I'm just one person and I have 27 students in my class and 16 of them have IEPs and what, right? And I tried to state in the caption, but I've learned that people don't read captions. This is not where people, right? Like, but this is a systemic failure, right? And so I feel like we've talked about this before. And again, I think I said this in the last episode that we just recorded. I don't know if it ever made it to tape or if it was a private conversation, but part of our role isn't just advocating for the learner. We are in part too advocating for the team. I actually think it was in one of the conversations with Colleen on Unfiltered IEPs that documenting what the accommodations are supposed to be, documenting what services are supposed to be in place, being really clear that this is supposed to be a push-in service, or this is supposed to be pull-out, or this is supposed to be done at whatever ratio, or right, like group individual, or whatever it may be. and making sure that's really clear
Mm-hmm.
helps the staff, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like it is an absolute systematic failure as far as I'm concerned, and we could go down the rabbit hole if you so desire, of how inclusion classrooms are often set up, right? We've got three third grades, but only one of them is our third grade classroom. And so if you have an IEP, you have to go to Miss Wright's class because she's our inclusion class, right? Like all the things. And
Mm-hmm.
so, of course, you end up in situations where you've got one teacher managing over 50% of the class being learners on IEPs. And of course, they're exhausted and they show up at IEP meetings saying things like, that is too much for me to track. And right. And then it comes across and is as very ableist and it's going to shut the conversation down. And right. Like some of the problems come from like systemic or systematic failure. Right. So, I just want to name that. But I do think there is like a narrative or a mentality, whatever the right words are,
Mm-hmm.
that we're already doing that anyway. It doesn't need to be in the IEP.
Mm-hmm. 100%. Yeah.
Right. And that can come from multiple places. It can come from like almost an exacerbation, like, huh, I've been told I have to do this for everybody, so this is right. It can come from like a great place of caring, like why wouldn't I show up and provide this for the learners in my class, right? But if we're relying on good intent, we can't assume that the next classroom is going to have a teacher with the bandwidth, the knowledge, the compassion, the whatever. Like it makes it too teacher dependent instead of this is the program that the learner needs, and it should be more independent than like the actual personnel, if that makes sense.
And I think and you brought three things came to mind for me when you said that. The first one is that yes, I will often hear that statement about, I'm doing this for all the learners, especially if you say something like for our PDA learners, right? So for those that are listening for PDA, it's pathological demand avoidance or persistent drive for autonomy. And when you say like building that relationship, creating safety, establishing trust, or we do that with all our learners. And it's like, well, no, you don't. Um, Not because you don't even not want to, but you just don't have the time sometimes to create that dynamic sometimes without that push to have to do it. So another thing when you talk about like we do that for all the learners, I'll hear that in a grade, right? So sometimes the curriculum standards and the approach require certain things in a grade, but as that learner goes up each grade, it's no longer something that is required, right? Because it's believed that they already know how to do that. That they
Right.
don't need repetition, that they don't need a visual piece, that they don't need that small group. And so then it doesn't get documented that while that was something we do for all second graders, we actually don't do that for third graders. And so
Right.
that needs to be documented into their IEP. Um, the other thing that you mentioned that comes to mind for me with the documentation piece of like, I have 15 learners with IEPs. In my son's IEP meeting, I actually was the one who brought it to the forefront for his teacher, for my other son, that I'm like, the type of individualized instruction that he needs for this need is not something that she would be able to provide him. And
100%.
that's not her responsibility because that's why he's in special education. That's
Yes.
why he has an IEP. That's why he gets specifically designed instruction. And I don't want to speak for her, but I feel like her facial expression was like, oh my gosh, like this parent gets it. Because my point was that I am asking about something, inquiring about something, requesting about something, and which I'm not going to go into detail and share because I want it to be something my son would be comfortable with me sharing. But I'm inquiring about this knowing he has an IEP, knowing that there are other individuals outside of his general education teacher that can provide this instruction. And so I think she was kind of like, okay, like, like she kind of had to like okay, like you're not like, no, I'm not trying to put things on you. And something that is a side note that I see a lot happen a lot is where one individual is expected, and a lot of times it's either the general education teacher or the special education teacher to do everything documented in the IEP. And sometimes I think that impacts the documentation too, because there is not this responsibility being acknowledged that this is a team and that each team member is responsible for pieces of this document. And instead, the onus gets placed on either the general education teacher or the special education teacher. And then that is why it becomes this battle of like, I don't know if I want that documented, or I don't like, let's just try it, or I don't know if I want that written down, because it's like you're adding more to my plate.
Yeah, no, you've hit on so many things that are super important to jump to mind. One is, I think it'd be really helpful for folks who are listening for us to really clearly delineate the difference between an accommodation and like specially designed instruction.
Yeah.
Right? Because I think that some of the sort of emotional response I'm seeing in the Instagram comment section is folks that are conflating those two things, and that they're thinking that allowing, an accommodation is anything that removes a barrier to access that does not change like the content or the curriculum for the learner, right? So that can be that the learner sits close to a peer that they feel safe with, or they sit closer to the teacher, or they get additional time, they have unrestricted access to a sensory tool, or they're allowed to get up and move, or what. There's a literally like unlimited amount, but like that's kind of the idea of an accommodation. Um, Specially designed instruction, sometimes called specialized academic instruction, SAI, SDI, because of course, why would we use the same acronym when we could have probably more than two, um, more
Because
than I
there's
can
also
count.
specifically design instruction.
Yes,
Like it's called
I'm
like many different things.
exactly. That is direct teaching provided by a special education instructor,
Mm-hmm.
right? So that is either push in or pull out
Mm-hmm.
services to support a learner's communication, their particular skill, a particular skill in an academic area,
Mm-hmm.
supporting executive function. Not that there aren't accommodations that can do some of those things, but it is direct teaching, it's direct services. And not that there isn't more than one thing that delineates an IEP from a 504, but
Sure, yeah.
that's the big one,
Yeah.
right? 504s are essentially accommodation plans.
Mm-hmm.
IEPs have that accommodation plan piece, and they have goals and direct services. So I think it's important to name those, like that differentiation.
Absolutely.
And then the other piece that came to mind, and just in full transparency, I lost and it came back, which is exciting when it comes back. Destiny. Is back to when I was supporting teachers. I had teachers that were the quote unquote inclusion teacher, and they really didn't know like what to do with it. And
Mm-hmm.
in the sense of, they did have a lot of learners in the room who had IEPs. They
Mm-hmm.
didn't necessarily have the collegial relationship one would hope for with their special education, like sort of partner.
Mm-hmm.
And they weren't sure what was sort of theirs to do and not theirs to do. And so I know, I don't know how long ago it was, I made some reel on Instagram about this idea of an action plan being part of the conversation during an IEP meeting, which is, let's say a learner has like, visual support, like a task analysis card or a visual schedule or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
Who's going to make it?
Right.
Who's going to teach the learner how to use it, right? Like, if the learner has like a visual calendar, is it just placed on their desk? Do they need to go through it with an adult so they can have some autonomy and some say and move some things around? Like, what does it look like in action? Who's creating the tool? Who's supporting the learner using the tool to make sure they know how to use it so that it actually does remove a barrier to access and doesn't just become another barrier? right? Like, yeah, all the things. And so I think that those pieces are really important. Being clear kind of what's what and who's responsible for those different pieces. I just think that was so important. You named both of those things.
Yeah, and you really get into like it's woven in there, but you really get into why we wanted this to be documentation and accessibility. Because what you're talking about is accessibility. And I think we initially were really talking about, thinking about accessibility for parents, but I think what you just lifted up was accessibility for everyone in the sense of like a lot of times the staff aren't aware of who's implementing what,
Sure.
right? They're not aware of like, so am I supposed to be providing this? And I've seen in IEP meetings where um and this is no offense to district personnel, but it's typically when district personnel have come in the room, right? They're coming from a policy standpoint, a compliance
Sure.
standpoint. They're not familiar with the learner, but they have reviewed the data, they reviewed the information, and those that are quality, because I've worked with some really good ones, they're able to see, okay, I get why this accommodation is being requested, or I get why this goal is being requested, but then they're not the ones putting it in practice, right? So then when it gets ready to go into the IEP, you might have a staff member that's really hesitant because they're like, okay, but who's doing that, right? Like they're like, who's going to do that? Who's supposed to do this, and that? And that might be the first time in the um history of that IEP and these services that somebody is finally asking this question and there's able to be this discussion
Right.
about, yes, who is going to do this? What does this realistically look like? I've really seen where related service providers who have come to the table with some ideas, or parents have come to the table, the related service provider is able to say, I actually can push in and do that.
Yes.
And you can automatically see like this weight lift off the educator because they're like, oh, I thought like I was going to be implementing that as the general education teacher. And it's like, little do they know, but us being the advocates, like we know, like that would not have even been your role to teach that skill.
Right, right, right. No, I think my wheels are like spinning. I don't know if my head is spinning, but my wheels are spinning on how to sort of link that action plan piece
Mhm.
into the documentation in like the supports for personnel section,
Mhm.
right? So, I'm thinking back to a situation, and again, for confidentiality reasons, I'll be careful like how I describe it, but a non-speaking learner who um, spent split time
Mhm.
between self-contained segregated classroom and mainstream,
Mhm.
and family really wanting their learner to have access to grade level content,
Mhm.
and the self-contained classroom teacher being given, of course, modified curriculum and not having the bandwidth or right to or time, or I
Mhm.
guess that goes along with bandwidth, but like they were already teaching their stuff.
Right.
So adapting grade level content to make it accessible for the learner really wasn't possible.
Mhm.
And gen ed teacher, like outside of their scope to be
Mhm.
able to adapt for the learner's needs.
Mhm.
So where does it land? And so I remember asking during an IEP meeting, what does your collaboration time look like? How
Mhm.
is that built in? And what would a typical week like? Often it was an elementary school, and oftentimes elementary schools will have like one day a week where there's like a late
Mhm.
start or an early release or whatever. So the staff gets like an hour or whatever to like go
Mhm.
with their cohorts and do some professional development collaboration and stuff.
Right.
But like how often does a general education teacher and a self-contained classroom teacher have the opportunity to really collaborate at right? And they both were just like, it's like not in our contract, it's not in our schedule, like, And so it's a systematic barrier. We actually have to change the placement of the learner to get them into the resource classroom, because that is more the role of the resource teacher, who is being given more collaboration time, does have it within their training and their professional scope to take grade level content and adapt it for the disabled learners they're supporting. We need to play within this system and shift it, but like, the bigger conversation outside of this IEP meeting is we need to look at the systematic barriers that we've got in place, and why are we segregating kids, and that's a whole topic for a different day. But I think that sort of naming that piece and asking at the table, like, what does your collaboration time look like behind the scenes? How can we add some of those minutes into the IEP in ways that feel doable, that don't overtax the team, but are still meaningful, because we want there to be collaboration? Does shifting some of the service delivery model of those related service providers to a push-in model, so that the general education teacher has the opportunity, it's almost like modeling for them, right? As part of their learning, oh, this is how we incorporate AAC into the classroom, or this is how I can break things down, or this, whatever the accommodation may be. Like, how are we helping you all work together without over like taxing your plate? And then how are we documenting that in the IEP so that it actually has to get done? And my big bugaboo, and I know it's your big bugaboo, is what does communication between home and school look like? And I don't care what your kid's placement is, that has to be an accommodation written into your child's IEP, is that there is a streamlined home to school communication system, and that needs to be defined what that looks like full stop.
Yeah, 100%. I I'm just thinking about like when this episode is going to come out. This is going to be a freaking amazing episode. That's all I'm thinking about, is like, this is such a good episode. No, but you just landed on so many things. Like, again, when we talk about that accessibility, when we talk about documentation, I literally, it is like you are asking them to take a fist to the face when you want them to document training for staff in the IEP. And that came to mind for me when you were talking about the use of the AAC. Um, I have so many in the past year. I would say I've gotten a lot more learners that are AAC users. The majority of my families I started out with were behavior-based, and like they were, because that is kind of the history. And then I started, of course, to get those that have autism and ADHD. Their learners are autistic or ADHD. They were seeking me out. And then within the past year, I've gotten sought out more with like some AAC users, and feeling like staff's not trained on things like that. And so that led to me drafting several letters stating that staff needs to have training on the AAC device, because I am having parents who are seeking out social media and are seeking out um, content specifically related to minimally speaking unreliable speakers. And so they're coming across AAC and they're incorporating that and requesting that for their own learner privately and at home, but then recognizing that the school is then delaying and not implementing or using said AAC device, which is a part of the communication. And so then we get back to that request for training and documenting that in the IEP. So that's the first thing that like popped out from what you were saying. The other thing is documenting how you're actually going to communicate. And I've had several families too within the past year where we have actually either set up like a quarterly meeting, but then we've also, for family to be involved as part of this communication discussion, but we've also had it documented how the related service provider and the educators were going to communicate and collaborate, because
Nice.
things that were being told to the parent from the related service provider and things that were being told to the parent by the gen ed or special education teacher weren't in line because they were not communicating until it was time for an IEP meeting.
Right. Right. Yeah, no, I mean, certainly not to push any kind of product in any way, shape, or form, but like that's why I created those communication logs.
And it's our podcast. You can push whatever the fuck you want. What? That's wild. Yes, Lisa has this great communication logs like resource that assists with communication and in my opinion can also help assist with data tracking.
Yeah, no, it can assist with data tracking. And it's been used in that way. But basically, like I created it because I do think that like where are the gaps in the process that create problems, and poor communication is like at the tippy top of the list. But documentation is up there, tracking appropriate data using appropriate measuring tools specifically with the individual learner in mind, all the things, right? And trying to hold that at the same time as holding that staff is stretched super thin and they don't have a ton of time. And like, I don't want to come in like, this is the only learner in your classroom that matters. And like, I need you to spend all right. Like, I don't want to come in that way. I want to come in like I'm holding space for you and your humanity. And this is information that's going to benefit all of us. And so when I created them, I mean, they're templates and they're definitely intended as templates. I want you to take them and par them down and make them super specific to your learner. But the way I've seen them used best is when the family like saves it to their Google Drive, like a copy of it to their Google Drive, because I am huge on the privacy of the learner and I should not be involved in daily, weekly, whatever communication between teams and families, right? But when the team gets together and they really hone in on what is it that we want to capture. And then the way that they're written is their checklist, like check all that apply. And so it's click, 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 short sentence, click, 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 short sentence. Like it should take somebody literally no more than 3 to 5 minutes to fill it out. And there's a space for a longer sort of correspondence from the family back, so that the family can capture what's happening on a daily basis or weekly basis. And the teams can decide, we want this as our daily communication. We want this every week. We want this every other Friday or every other Thursday. I had a team want to do it on Thursdays because if something had gone askew or whatever, they wanted Friday for repair with the learner. This was straight out of an educator's mouth. I want Friday to be able to repair with the learner. I want Friday to be able to repair with you to recalibrate before the weekend so that nobody has to wait through the weekend feeling like their questions went unanswered. I was like, okay, lovely, beautiful. Isn't that just so nice? I was so excited. This was just last week. Or no, yeah, this last week. I've lost track of time. But yeah, it was fantastic. Special educator, new case manager for this learner. We did a little switchy switch. It was all thumbs up. Thank you. Thank you. Last person forgot to put on their collaboration hat. So this person came with all the hats. It was quite lovely. But yeah, I mean, I've had families use it where they collate the data that was collected at school and present the school data to the team to say, we need a different level of service.
And I've done that.
Right? And then the team, of course, is like, that's home data.
I've done that as a parent.
Right. Yeah. That's not home data, my friend. That's data from the communication logs from school. I just took the time to put it all together for you. It's a present. Merry Christmas.
No, but again, when we talk about that documentation piece too, because I think like we've mentioned a lot with the IEP, and we're going to do a whole episode on like data. So this is not what this is. But what you covered in that, it speaks to like documentation outside of that too, right? It's like documentation is also data. And a lot of times when I get into IEP meetings and I'm asking questions or when I'm reviewing, because when I have my families send me their documentation. I tell them, like, send me suspension, send me all these things, right? And I'm reviewing them and I start asking questions. And they're like, oh, I don't know. Like, I don't know. And so then we get in the meeting, or like I draft the letter and we send it, because I'm big on sending a letter, because I want you to come into the meeting prepared to know what we're talking about and to have the information. Like, don't waste our time and we don't want to waste yours. And
Yes.
so they come in there and I'm like, and they'll be like, oh, we're gonna discuss those questions. And sometimes as they're answering them, you start to see the light bulbs go off of them connecting a trend. And
Yes.
an example that I give when it comes to that documentation piece was that when my son was in first grade, we started to notice between 2 and 2:30 was when we would get a phone call. The school day was almost over. He had like less than an hour left of school.
Right.
And at that school, they had a crisis team. And so they were like, when I said it, I said, do you all realize that you have called us like every time it's in between 2 and 2:30? The crisis team, who was made of school staff, was able to go, yes, she's correct, because they're like, I remember, they're like, the last 3 times that we've been called for him, it's been like 2:10, 2:15, 2:20.
Right.
We were all then able to go, because the crisis team doesn't go to the IEP meeting. They're part. So when some
Sure.
learners are part of a DODEA school, which is the Department of Defense Education Act. So those are sometimes the schools that are on military bases. They do create a crisis team. And so the crisis team is typically the team that responds to any type of safety concerns. And so we were then able to go into the IEP meeting and sit down and go, yeah, like, because they were, of course, like we had an excellent school psychologist, and she's like, well, let's look at the logs. Let's look, like just to make sure. And we were able to see that, like, yes, it was during that time. And what we were able to determine was that the transition from specials to math, where they were in centers and he was behind on the task they were doing, was causing him frustration.
Sure.
And so we decided to add in a break to prepare him for the transition back into the classroom, the activity he was going to go engage in, and where he was going to be at in the activity, remind him, you're not behind, you're not all these things. And then front loading. And,
Right.
and so people don't know, if front loading is essentially like you are preparing the learner, the staff. You front load anyone, but you're preparing them for what's to come to try and prevent potential dysregulation. And so, but that documentation piece that came out of that was like me tracking, because I was just like, I'm noticing a trend. We need to request a meeting. And then it was like, yes, it was the specific time. And then feeling that comfort, say, or confirmation. Like they said it right in front of like administration and everything. They were just like, she's absolutely correct. Like you have you called us on the wall. But it was that documentation. So documentation is not just how you are documenting things in the IEP. Just emails or collecting, that all can point documentation for your learner.
Yeah, absolutely. And we could, I mean, for the sake of time, we probably won't go into all the things now, but sort of differentiating between what should go in an email, what should be in more of like a formal letter, formal concerns letter, when you're requesting a PWN, which is a prior written notice, which is a formal documentation from a district to a family, prior to taking any sort of action. So whether they're going to do something or they're going to deny doing something, like they have to send a letter. And I have to say that PWNs are used completely inconsistently across the country, because why not?
That's correct.
Here in California.
Just as a FYI, just piggyback off what Lisa's saying real quick. Some states, they have actually done it to where they have certain documents that are stated in their state law that is their PWN. So make sure when you're looking at your state and you're looking at, it's not always just called a prior written notice. In some states, in their state law, it will say the such and such document stands as the prior written notice.
Nice. Little nugget of information from Dr. Destiny Huff. I love it. Yeah, no, nothing is consistent, and we could really go down a rabbit hole of how this current administration is making things even less consistent. But for the sake of our sanity in this moment, we won't. Destiny just took a sip of her drink, and she's gonna choke.
Because Lisa always tries to get me right when I'm taking a sip of something, and I'm like, no.
Oh, heavens to Betsy. Okay. The other piece that I do want to touch on, not that we haven't woven it in, is I feel like we started to touch on this a little bit in the bias episode, but I wanted to lift it up again here, is sort of the parents' accessibility to the process.
Mm-hmm.
That there are some families that are of the mindset that like that's a school thing and the school folks are the experts and like my voice doesn't matter and I shouldn't have a say, or I don't have a say in what happens there because that's a school thing and that's those folks' domain.
Mm-hmm.
And then you've got the exact opposite of that where they're like, I know my kid, I know everything, and I'm going to come in and I'm just going to like sort of take over all the things, right? And like I said, sort of back to when this idea kind of came into my mind was, I think we see this happen a lot in an IEP process where the folks that sit at that table routinely sort of know the gig, right? They know how it works. They think they know how it works. Some know better than others. But like they're familiar with the process. It's something they engage in routinely. Right. And there's a different level of sort of understanding than especially folks who are newer to the IEP process have, right? And there's that whole emotional piece. You've spoken to this before, that like when you're wearing your mom hat in an IEP meeting, like you're going to respond and react in a really different way than when you're wearing your advocate hat, right? Because you've got that 1 degree of separation, and so you can kind of stay in your thinking brain. And so, you know, I find that parents sort of respond, generally speaking, in sort of 2 extremes. Obviously, there's a whole lot of gray area in between, but you have folks that are moved to silence. And they kind of nod along, and even if they're not understanding anything that's being said, they're like, well, these folks have it and I don't know enough to even ask a question.
Freeze or fawn.
Right. They're exactly freeze or fawn. And then you've got folks that have like been on the not so good side of the internet where they're like, get ready to fight. And they come in just charging. Right out of the gate. Right. And so, you know, I do think, and I think this is fair to say, that there is an element in an IEP process that feels very counterintuitive. That like common sense isn't at play. And so for some folks are like, it just doesn't make any sense to me. Right. And then there's others that are like, I'm too embarrassed to say I don't know what you're talking about. Right. You know, and so I don't know that we are going to be able to like solve this problem today, but I just want to name it. And just sort of welcome everybody who's here listening who maybe does feel shut down in those meetings, that isn't quite sure what to say, is overwhelmed by the enormity of the process, who feels like you have to know everything before, right? Like, no, you don't. You can always pause and say, I'm so sorry. I'm not quite sure what that means. Because I do think that, obviously not always, but most of the time when folks are just kind of steamrolling through the process, they don't realize they're kind of leaving the parents behind or the caretaker behind. And so if
Absolutely.
you have them press pause, then they are more willing to like break it down, generally speaking.
Yeah, no, that's so important to state too. I've had meetings where the person running the meeting was just, going through like they're supposed to, saying, saying the things going through them. And I've actually just, paused and was like, um, for some of my parents, I'm able to just kind of go, so that means da 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 da. And the staff is able to say, yes, thank you, Dr. Huff. Sorry, I'm so used to saying this, but let's try and put it down a little and explore. Sometimes I'll have parents who will text me because again, I attend all my things virtually. And so I am the sort of like I'll weave it into my response when I speak out in the meeting, when I come off mute. But no, it's just like I think about myself as a mental health professional when I would be and I would go through the assessment of the parent. A lot of times they're familiar with. And so they're looking like, so you're saying they do have depression, have anxiety. like that's what they're looking for. Similar to IEP, parents are looking for, so you are address the concern I have, are going to support them. So, yeah, I've had situations where in IEP meetings where, the parent is just unfamiliar with the terms, like you were saying. And as I say, like, if your learner does have an IEP throughout their entire educational career, it's important for you to know what's in the learner's IEP. And so
Yes.
my son, his kindergarten year, he went through 3 teachers because they left the district because the district was not a good district. And so the next person has to come in and be able to understand. And a lot of times they lean on the parent the educator typically does, especially the general educator, to be like, hey, what's worked? I'm just trying to have that relationship and build that rapport. And so it's very important that we take the time to break down for parents what is in the IEP and help them understand the services. And whenever I do my IEP reviews, sometimes when I go through the evaluation results and the IEPs and make the connection for the parents, that's the first time that somebody has used plain English to explain to them how this is reflective of their learner and connect
Right.
for them why they see the things they see or see the barriers that they have or see the strengths that they have.
Yes. Yes, absolutely. I have the same experience. And like I said, I don't know that we necessarily can like answer every question and solve this problem on this podcast, but I just want to name it that I think it's a more common experience than not that parents feel that the process in and of itself is not accessible and that there's all these acronyms flying around and there's language flying around and descriptions flying around that just don't feel like their learner or just feel overwhelming or like we said earlier, like just feel ick. And I just, not that you need my permission, but think it's granted to like ask the question or pause the process or say, can somebody explain this to me like not using sort of special education ease? Like I need it sort of broken down in a way that's more accessible for me because I'm not really following. Like, what does that actually look like? Kind of going back to what you were asking earlier, and I actually think it was in the previous episode that we recorded earlier today. Brain is mushing everything together. Of like asking, what does this look like, and how is this happening, and and being clear. Like, I'm not trying to interrogate anybody. I'm not tracking this. I'm not following along.
Absolutely.
And how are we documenting this?
Yes.
How is this noted in the IEP? Can we look at that language?
Yes. So, yeah, so I mean, again, today we were talking about documentation and accessibility. And I think we just really wanted to point out the importance of, for our school staff, documenting what you're doing. I'm like, get your credit. You guys do a lot. Like documenting what you're actually doing, what you're actually trying, what's actually working, what's actually not. And then, also on the other side of that, making it accessible for parents. And so parents feeling comfortable enough to say, I don't understand that, or I have a question, or to say, I have one parent that will say, like, I'm sure I'll have some questions later after the meeting is over. How do I get those questions to you all? Because she's aware that it's a lot. Her learner is higher support needs. And she's like, and so I'm processing all this and taking it all in. I'm going to need time to look at, before we have this meeting and after, and then I can get back with you. So keeping documentation and accessibility at the forefront. Also, you can go to lisabaskinwright.com to find those communication logs, because again, this is our podcast and we can advertise whatever we want in that regard. And make sure that you're following us on the Affirming Village podcast. You can also follow us at Lisa Baskin Wright and Destiny Huff _IEP_advocate. And thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you again for joining us here in the Affirming Village. We're your co-hosts, Dr. Destiny Huff and Lisa Baskin Wright, and we hope today's conversation leaves you feeling seen, supported, and better equipped to advocate for yourself or your learner. If you enjoyed today's episode, be sure to subscribe, leave a review, and share this with someone else in the village. Until next time, keep advocating, keep affirming, and keep building the village we all deserve.